You wake up, and before you are even fully conscious, you have already used electricity 4 times. The alarm that woke you, electricity. The light you turned on, electricity. The hot water for your shower, electricity heating the boiler. The phone you checked before your feet hit the floor, electricity, obviously. Electricity squared, electricity with an attitude problem. Now subtract all of it. Not as a thought experiment, as a reality. You wake up before dawn. Not because your alarm went off, but because the cold has become intolerable, and the thin straw mattress between you and the frozen ground has given up any pretense of providing insulation. The room is dark, not dim, not shadowy, not the manageable darkness of a room with curtains drawn. Dark in the way that a sealed box is dark, the kind of dark where you genuinely cannot see your hand in front of your face if the clouds are covering the moon and the fire has gone out. The fire, you need to check the fire. You feel your way across the room, past the sleeping forms of your children, around the leg of the table that finds your shin with the unerring accuracy of furniture in the dark, toward the hearth where the coals from last night are either still glowing or have gone completely cold. And the difference between those 2 outcomes determines whether the next 10 minutes of your life involve carefully adding wood to a surviving ember or the laborious process of starting fire from scratch with flint and steel and the specific language that comes out of people trying to start fires with flint and steel in the cold before dawn. This is your morning, every morning, for your entire life. You are a medieval peasant, and the year is approximately 1280. And you have never heard of electricity, not even as a concept, not even as the word, because the word doesn't exist yet, and the thing it describes won't be harnessed for human use for another 600 years. What you have instead is fire, ingenuity, accumulated knowledge, community, and a tolerance for darkness and discomfort that modern people, raised in a world of effortless artificial light and push-button heat, find genuinely difficult to comprehend. Here is the thing that this video is going to argue, clearly and with evidence. The medieval peasant's life without electricity was not simply a degraded version of modern life. It was a different life, organized around different rhythms, sustained by different knowledge, and in some respects, not all respects. Let's be clear, not the respects involving tooth extraction or smallpox, more sophisticated than we give it credit for. When we flip a switch and the room fills with light, we are the beneficiaries of an infrastructure of extraordinary complexity. The power plant, the grid, the wiring, the bulb, the entire chain of engineering and energy production that makes the switch work. We understand almost none of it. We press the switch, the light comes on. We never think about it again. The medieval person who needed light had to understand, deeply and practically, the entire chain of production that made that light possible. From the rushes growing in the marsh, to the tallow rendered from the autumn slaughter, to the specific technique of dipping that produced a rushlight that burned for the right amount of time, at the right level of brightness, without dripping or guttering in the drafts. They made the thing. They understood the thing. The relationship between the medieval person and their light source was one of genuine knowledge and genuine craft, as opposed to the modern relationship, which is essentially a consumer relationship with a very long supply chain. We're going to look at all of it: light, heat, food preservation, communication, time, work, entertainment, medicine, the full picture of what human life looks like when you take away the electron and replace it with ingenuity and accumulated knowledge, and the specific stubbornness of a species that has survived ice ages and plagues and several centuries of being medieval and come out the other side. We're going to be honest about what was hard, and some of it was genuinely, specifically, historically hard, in ways that we should acknowledge rather than romanticize. But we're also going to be honest about what was impressive, because some of it was impressively, surprisingly, satisfyingly impressive in ways that don't get enough credit. No electricity. Let's see how they managed. Chapter 1. Light before the bulb. How medieval people conquered darkness. Before we can understand how medieval people managed light, we need to understand what darkness actually meant in a pre-electric world. And to do that, we need to unlearn something that modern life has taught us so thoroughly that we've stopped noticing we learned it. Modern darkness is optional. In 2024, in virtually any part of the developed world, darkness is a choice. You choose to turn the lights off. You choose to go somewhere without electrical infrastructure. Darkness is something you enter deliberately, something you can exit at will with the press of a switch, something that presents essentially no practical obstacle to any activity you want to perform. The darkness of a modern bedroom at night is a managed darkness, controllable, temporary, completely within your command. Medieval darkness was not optional. Medieval darkness was structural. It was the default state of every interior and every exterior from sunset to sunrise, penetrated only by whatever light sources you had the knowledge, materials, and resources to produce. And the implications of this fundamental difference rippled through every aspect of medieval life in ways that are worth taking seriously. The medieval day was organized around the sun with a literalness and a completeness that modern life has made almost impossible to imagine. The sun rising was not simply pleasant or photogenic. It was the beginning of the possibility of productive work. The sun setting was not simply atmospheric. It was a hard deadline, after which most activities became dramatically more difficult, more expensive in terms of light fuel consumption, and more dangerous. The medieval agricultural year, the medieval work schedule, the medieval social calendar. All of them were fundamentally shaped by the availability of natural light in ways that went far deeper than simple inconvenience. The summer solstice in England gives approximately 17 hours of daylight. The winter solstice gives approximately 7. That swing of 10 hours represents the difference between the most productive season of the medieval year and the most constrained one, and the management of that difference, the way medieval communities adjusted their rhythms, their work, their social life, and their use of artificial light to the dramatic seasonal variation in available daylight, was one of the central organizing challenges of medieval existence. Now let's look at what they actually used to push back the dark. The fire was primary. In a medieval peasant cottage, the central hearth that provided heat and cooking also provided light, not as a designed secondary function, but as an inseparable byproduct of combustion. Firelight is not particularly good reading light, and it is not the steady, directable beam of a modern lamp. It is warm, orange, flickering, omnidirectional light that illuminates a room in the way that mood lighting illuminates a restaurant, atmospherically, impressionistically, with shadows that shift and dance and that make fine detail work genuinely difficult. But it is light, meaningful, free, in the sense that the fire was burning anyway, and sufficient for the kinds of work that constitute most of medieval domestic evening life: spinning, conversation, eating, the maintenance of social bonds that was itself a form of work in a world where those bonds were a survival resource. The rushlight was the primary manufactured light source of the medieval poor, and it deserves considerably more attention than it typically gets in popular histories because it was a genuinely ingenious solution to a specific engineering problem, produced from materials that were genuinely available to the poorest households, with a process that was genuinely learnable and genuinely effective. The rushlight was made from the common bulrush, Juncus effusus, or related species, that grew in the marshes, riverbanks, and wet meadows that were features of the English and continental European landscape. Rushes were gathered in late summer, when the stems were at their most robust and prepared through a specific process. The outer green skin was peeled away in a single continuous strip down the length of the rush, leaving just enough skin attached on one side to provide structural support, so that the white pith inside was exposed but the rush remained intact enough to hold its shape. The prepared rush was then dried, briefly just enough to remove surface moisture, and drawn through a container of melted tallow, rendered animal fat, coating the pith with fat that would serve as fuel when the rush burned. The result was a rush light of approximately 30 centimeters in length that burned for roughly 30 to 40 minutes, providing soft but workable light, sufficient for close work, like spinning or sewing if held close enough to the work surface. The cost was minimal. Rushes were free, and the tallow came from the fat of the autumn-slaughtered animals. The preparation was time-consuming, but not skilled. It was the kind of work that could be done by children, by elderly household members, by anyone with functioning hands, and the patience to peel rushes in quantity. The 18th century naturalist Gilbert White, who investigated the rural light practices of Hampshire, England, calculated that a pound of tallow could produce approximately 80 rush lights, each burning for about 40 minutes. A diligent family could prepare enough rush lights for a winter evening's illumination in a single afternoon of rush preparation. This was not negligible labor, but it was entirely manageable as part of the household economy, and the result was a light source that served the household's needs without requiring money, specialized suppliers, or any technology beyond a container for melted fat. The tallow candle was the next step up the illumination hierarchy. More expensive than the rushlight, requiring more processed materials, but providing better quality light that was more stable, more directional, and could be placed in a holder and left to burn without someone holding it. Tallow candles were made from rendered animal fat, typically mutton or beef tallow, which was melted, strained to remove impurities, and then applied to wicks, usually twisted cotton or plant fiber, either by dipping, the most common method, or by molding. Dip-making tallow candles was a straightforward but time-consuming process. The wick was dipped into the melted tallow, withdrawn and allowed to cool briefly, then dipped again, the layer of tallow building up gradually with each dipping until the candle reached the desired diameter. A batch of candles could be made in a day by an experienced candle maker, and the skill involved was primarily in managing the temperature of the tallow. Too hot, and the tallow poured off the wick between dips. Too cold, and it didn't adhere properly, and the timing of the dipping cycles. Tallow candles had specific shortcomings that anyone who has only experienced modern paraffin or beeswax candles would find surprising. Tallow is animal fat, and animal fat has a characteristic smell when burned. Not unpleasant exactly, but distinctly animal, particularly in the specific notes that the burning fat's chemical breakdown produces. In a room where tallow candles were the only light source, that smell was a constant ambient feature. Tallow also had a relatively low melting point, which meant that in warm conditions, a warm summer room, proximity to a working fire, tallow candles could become soft, bend, drip excessively, and generally lose their structural integrity in ways that made them messy and inefficient. Beeswax candles were the premium product, available to wealthy households, churches, and monasteries, but genuinely expensive for most people. Beeswax burned more cleanly than tallow, produced a brighter and steadier flame, had a pleasant natural honey scent rather than tallow's animal notes, and held its shape better in warm conditions. The church used beeswax candles extensively for liturgical purposes, and the beeswax candle trade was significant enough to sustain a substantial commercial beekeeping industry throughout the medieval period. But for the peasant household, beeswax was aspirational illumination, used, perhaps for a single candle on a special occasion, not as the daily light source. The oil lamp was another light technology that existed in the medieval period, more common in southern Europe, where olive oil was more readily available, and less common in northern Europe, where olive oil was expensive and animal fats were the natural choice. The simple oil lamp, a shallow container of oil with a wick resting in it, was a design that dated back to prehistoric times, and that provided a steady, efficient, relatively odor-neutral flame when fueled with a good quality oil. In areas where locally pressed vegetable oils were available, walnut oil, linseed oil, rapeseed oil, the oil lamp served as a practical alternative to tallow candles. The lantern was the technology that made light portable. A candle or oil lamp enclosed in a frame of horn, oiled paper or thin sheets of membrane that protected the flame from wind and precipitation while allowing light to pass through. Horn. Lanterns, made from flattened, scraped animal horn, which becomes somewhat translucent when worked thin, were among the most common portable light technologies of the medieval period, and the image of a lantern-bearing figure moving through the dark. The night watchman, the person returning late from a neighbor's house, the farmer checking on animals in the middle of the night, was a ubiquitous element of medieval visual culture. The specific technique of navigating by lantern light through the genuine darkness of a pre-electric rural landscape required adaptation. The human eye, when properly dark adapted after 30 minutes in low light conditions, is considerably more sensitive than its performance in ordinary lighted environments suggests. The rod cells of the retina, the photoreceptors that handle low light vision, are capable of detecting single photons under optimal conditions, and the fully dark adapted eye can navigate a moonlit landscape, read large text by moonlight, and distinguish shapes and obstacles at distances that would seem impossible to someone whose eyes have not had time to adapt. Medieval people, whose evenings were routinely spent in conditions of low natural and artificial light, were probably better dark adapted more habitually than their modern equivalents. The moon was a genuine illumination resource in the pre-electric world. The full moon on a clear night provides sufficient light to move through a landscape comfortably, to perform outdoor work if the task doesn't require color discrimination or fine detail, and to navigate roads and paths with confidence. Medieval calendars tracked lunar phases carefully, and the timing of evening activities, late social visits, night journeys, outdoor work in harvest season that had to continue after sunset, was often planned around the lunar calendar in ways that made practical use of available natural illumination. Medieval monasteries and religious institutions had a specific relationship with light that shaped both their use of artificial illumination and their approach to the problem of working in darkness. The canonical hours, the 8 times of prayer that structured the monastic day, required monks to be awake and active at specific hours that did not always align with natural daylight. Matins, the night office, required waking in the middle of the night for prayer. The monastic response to this challenge was practical. The dormitory was lit, the church was lit, the cloisters were lit, and the accumulated fuel expenditure of a large monastery on illumination was significant enough to be a line item in monastic accounts. The scriptorium, the room in which monks and scholars copied manuscripts, was one of the places where the limitations of medieval artificial light were most practically significant. Manuscript copying required fine detail work, precise letter forms, careful use of pen and ink, the management of elaborate, decorated initials and illuminated pages. That was extremely difficult in poor light. Monasteries therefore positioned their scriptoria to maximize natural light, typically facing south or southeast to capture morning light, with windows of the maximum size that the structural requirements of stone construction permitted. Copying work was concentrated in the daylight hours, and the artificial light sources used for scriptoria work were the best available. Beeswax candles rather than tallow, positioned carefully to illuminate the manuscript without casting shadows from the copyist's own hand. The specific problem of reading and writing in pre-electric light is worth dwelling on for a moment, because it had real consequences for the transmission of knowledge through the medieval period. The limited availability of good artificial light was one of the factors that made literacy genuinely difficult to maintain outside institutions with resources to sustain it. The monastery, the noble household, the prosperous merchant family, the peasant household that might have had a literate member had, in the long winter evenings, limited light for reading and writing, which meant that even those few peasants who had acquired literacy had limited opportunity to exercise and maintain it. The darkness was not neutral. It had specific effects on what kinds of knowledge could be sustained and transmitted, and those effects reinforced the institutional concentration of literacy that characterized medieval intellectual life. The craftsmen who worked at detailed tasks in medieval workshops, goldsmiths, painters, illuminators, fine weavers, developed specific practical strategies for managing the light problem. The positioning of the workspace to capture north light, which, while dimmer than south-facing light, is more consistent throughout the day and free of the glare and deep shadows that direct sunlight creates, is a principle that artists and craftspeople maintained from the medieval period through the Renaissance and into the modern era. The north-facing artist's studio is not a modern convention. It is a solution to a specific light quality problem that was first systematically addressed by craftspeople working in the pre-electric era. The social dimension of light distribution in medieval communities was a form of resource sharing that operated on the same mutual aid principles as other community resources. The communal fire in the village hall or the church provided light as well as heat for evening gatherings, and the practice of gathering in a single, well-lit space, rather than each household maintaining its own light source, was an economically rational response to the cost of illumination. The spinning bee, the evening gathering of neighbors around a single fire, the communal storytelling sessions of the long winter evenings. These were not simply social pleasures, but practical light-sharing arrangements that made the most of limited illumination resources. The village church deserves specific mention in this context. Medieval churches were often the largest, most substantially lit interior spaces available to rural communities. They had windows designed to bring in natural light. They had institutional resources to maintain candles and oil lamps, and they were spaces where the whole community gathered regularly. The church was therefore not just a religious institution, but a community light resource, one of the few places where most members of a rural community could experience a reasonably well-lit interior space. The beauty of candlelight in a stone church, the way tallow candles and beeswax tapers illuminated the faces of statues, the way the wavering light animated the painted figures on the walls, was not merely atmospheric. It was a genuine luxury, a quality of light that most people experienced only in the church context, which contributed to the church's aura of specialness and divine presence. The medieval darkness was real. It constrained what people could do in evenings and shaped the entire social and work rhythm of pre-electric life. But the response to it, the accumulated technology of rushlights and tallow candles and oil lamps and lanterns and dark adapted eyes and carefully positioned workspaces and communal light sharing, was not a failure to solve the problem. It was a pragmatic, resourceful, and in many respects, sophisticated adaptation to a genuine constraint. Chapter 2. Heat without a thermostat. The science and art of staying warm. Here is a fact that seems simple and turns out to be profound. Your body generates heat. Not a trivial amount of heat either. A resting adult produces roughly 80 watts of thermal energy continuously, just through the metabolic work of keeping itself alive. A working adult generates considerably more. The reason you don't burn yourself isn't that your body doesn't produce heat. It's that your body loses heat at exactly the rate it produces it, through radiation, convection, evaporation, and conduction, maintaining the narrow thermal balance that constitutes a normal body temperature. Managing heat, keeping your body from losing it faster than you produce it in cold conditions, and ensuring that the spaces you need to inhabit for work and sleep and social life are warm enough to function in, was one of the most important practical problems of medieval daily life. Without electricity, without gas central heating, without the network of pipes and radiators and thermostats that modern buildings use to maintain a consistent thermal environment, the medieval person had to solve this problem using direct manipulation of combustion, insulation, and the thermal properties of the materials available to them. They solved it, not perfectly. There are things in the medieval thermal management system that required genuine tolerance for discomfort. But with a sophistication and a practical intelligence that the popular image of medieval peasants huddled miserably around inadequate fires does not capture. Let's start with the building, because the building was the first line of thermal defense and medieval building design, particularly in Northern Europe, where the thermal management problem was most acute. Incorporated principles of heat retention that were genuinely sophisticated. The medieval peasant cottage was not designed in any formal sense. There were no architects, no engineering calculations, no building regulations. It was designed in the same way that most pre-modern technology was designed, by accumulated empirical observation about what worked, transmitted through generations of people building and living in buildings, and noticing which features kept them warmer and which didn't. The result was a building type that, for all its apparent simplicity, incorporated multiple thermal management principles that modern building physics validates. The thick walls of stone or rammed earth, where they existed, provided thermal mass, the ability to absorb heat during periods when the fire was burning strongly and release it slowly during periods when the fire was low or out, smoothing the temperature fluctuations that a fire-heated space otherwise experiences. A stone wall 2 feet thick has a thermal lag of many hours. It warms slowly and cools slowly, acting as a thermal buffer that keeps the interior temperature more stable than it would be in a thin-walled structure. The low ceiling of the typical peasant cottage was not a failure of ambition. It was a practical thermal choice. Hot air rises, and a room with a low ceiling has a smaller volume of air above the occupants that needs to be heated. The warmest zone of a heated room is always at head height, and below, the zone where people actually live. And a low ceiling kept that warm zone from extending uselessly upward into the rafters, wasting heat energy on warming air that nobody was using. The thatched roof was both a structural element and a thermal element. A thick thatch of straw or reeds, anything from 12 to 18 inches in a well-built roof, is a remarkably effective insulator, comparable in its thermal resistance to a significant thickness of modern insulation material. The trapped air within the thatched layers, the same principle that makes modern glass wool and foam insulation effective, provides genuine resistance to heat flow, keeping the warmth in during winter and, equally importantly, the heat out during summer. A well-thatched building stays warmer in winter and cooler in summer than the outside conditions would suggest, and this passive thermal regulation required no energy input and no maintenance beyond the occasional rethatching that the roof's gradual deterioration required. The earth floor, beaten, compacted earth, sometimes covered with rushes, was a good thermal surface in one specific respect. The ground itself is a heat store. At a depth of a few feet, the soil maintains a remarkably constant temperature year-round. In temperate climates, approximately 10 to 12 degrees Celsius, which is cold but considerably warmer than outdoor air temperatures in winter. A building with an earth floor in close thermal contact with the ground was benefiting from this geothermal heat source, not dramatically but measurably. The floor was warmer than it would have been if exposed to the same conditions as the walls, and the heat rising from the floor contributed to the room's thermal balance. The animals in the longhouse, the arrangement in which livestock and humans shared a single building, are usually presented as primitive cohabitation, a mark of the medieval peasants' low standard of living. But from a thermal management perspective, it was brilliant. A cow generates approximately the same heat as a small space heater running continuously. Several cows, several pigs, and a flock of sheep sharing the same building as a human family are providing a thermal contribution that is absolutely not nothing in a northern European winter. The accumulated body heat of the animals was a significant element in the overall thermal balance of the longhouse, keeping the human living space warmer than it would have been if the animals had been housed separately. The specific innovation of the wall fireplace with chimney, which spread gradually through the later medieval period, replacing or supplementing the central open hearth, was a significant advance in thermal efficiency. The central open hearth on the floor with a smoke hole in the roof lost a considerable proportion of its heat energy through the smoke hole along with the smoke. The heat that went up with the smoke was heat that didn't warm the room. The wall fireplace with chimney directed the smoke out through a contained channel, allowing the fireplace to be set back into the wall where it could radiate heat into the room rather than losing it equally in all directions. And the chimney design, the constriction that accelerates the draft, pulling air through the fire more efficiently, improved the combustion efficiency of the fuel. The management of the fire itself was a skill of genuine complexity that took years to develop properly. The modern person's relationship with fire begins and ends with the gas lighter or the box of matches. We provide the ignition, and the designed fuel source, gas, pressed wood log, charcoal, does the rest. The medieval person's relationship with fire was a continuous, active engagement with a living process that required ongoing attention and judgment. The type of wood mattered enormously. Different wood species have different energy densities, different combustion characteristics, and different appropriateness for different purposes. Oak, ash, and other hardwoods burn slowly and produce sustained, high-energy heat, ideal for maintaining a cooking fire over hours or for banking the fire overnight. Softwoods, pine, fir, willow, burn faster and hotter but for shorter durations, making them useful for starting fires and for applications requiring quick, intense heat. Green, freshly cut wood burns poorly and produces more smoke than heat. Properly seasoned wood, dried for at least a year, burns more completely and more efficiently. Every person who managed a medieval household fire understood these distinctions intuitively and made continuous practical decisions based on them. The banking of the fire for the night was one of the most important practical skills of medieval domestic life, and getting it wrong had real consequences. A fire that was allowed to go out completely overnight required relighting in the morning, a process that with flint and steel and tinder could take anywhere from a few minutes to a frustrating half hour, depending on conditions. A fire that was too large and too active overnight consumed fuel unnecessarily and posed a fire hazard. The properly banked fire buried in its own ash, just enough air circulation maintained to keep the coals alive, stable and self-maintaining through the night, required specific knowledge of fire behavior and specific technique to achieve reliably. The specific technique of ash banking. After the evening fire had burned down to a solid bed of coals, ash from the edges of the hearth was raked over the coals, covering them partially but not completely, reducing the oxygen supply to the burning surface and therefore slowing the combustion rate dramatically. The ash layer served as insulation, keeping the coals' heat concentrated and preventing the rapid loss of thermal energy that would occur if the coals were exposed to the room's air currents. A properly banked fire could maintain live coals for 8 to 10 hours, allowing the household to sleep and wake too, something that could be revived into a working fire in minutes by removing the ash layer and applying a small amount of additional wood and breath. The medieval solution to the challenge of carrying fire from one location to another, sharing fire with a neighbor whose fire had gone out, transporting fire from the central village fire to a household hearth, was the clay or iron fire pot, a container that could hold live coals safely, allowing transport of fire without the open flame danger of carrying a burning torch. The fire pot was both a practical implement and an expression of the community resource sharing that characterized medieval village life. Fire was something that could be lent and borrowed between households, and the person who kept fire alive through the night was providing a community service that their neighbors might call upon. The specific problem of warming the sleeping body through a night when the fire was necessarily low was addressed through a combination of strategies that were individually modest but collectively effective. Multiple wool blankets, layered rather than relying on a single thick one, trapped air more effectively and provided better insulation than a single thick blanket of equivalent total weight. The bed itself, typically a wooden frame with a woven or solid base, topped with a straw-stuffed mattress tick, provided some insulation from the cold floor. Bed curtains, where they existed in households that could afford the cloth, created a microclimate within the sleeping area that the sleeper's own body heat could warm more easily than the full room. The warming pan, a long-handled metal container holding live coals run between the bed sheets before getting in, was a technology for pre-warming the bed that operated on the simple principle of using the coals' stored thermal energy to raise the temperature of the bedding material before the occupant had to enter the cold bed. It worked. Modern tests of warming pans by people who have wondered about this confirm that they are effective at raising sheet temperature to genuinely comfortable levels, and the pre-warmed bed was a genuine luxury that made the prospect of getting into a cold bed on a winter night substantially less aversive. The communal fire was a winter institution in many medieval communities. The great fire in the village hall or the Lord's Manor Hall, around which the community gathered on the coldest evenings, represented both a thermal resource and a social one. The gathering of bodies in a single space was itself thermally meaningful. A room full of people is warmer than the same room empty, and the body heat of the community was a genuine supplement to the fire's warmth. The social activity that accompanied the communal gathering, the storytelling, the singing, the communal craftwork of the winter spinning session was both a response to the available warmth and a generator of additional warmth through the metabolic activity of engaged, active people. The clothing strategies for maintaining body warmth without external heating deserve their own consideration, because the medieval person's understanding of thermal insulation through clothing was practical and sophisticated in ways that predate the modern science of thermal dynamics by several centuries. Wool was the primary thermal material of the medieval period, and its specific thermal properties, the ability to retain warmth even when wet, the natural crimp of the fiber that traps air in the spaces between strands, the lanolin content of less processed wools that provided some natural water resistance, made it genuinely superior to the alternatives available for most thermal applications. The medieval person who wore multiple layers of wool, the linen undergarment directly against the skin, the wool tunic, the wool overgarment, the wool cloak, was applying the same layering principle that modern outdoor clothing manufacturers use for the same physical reasons. Linen against the skin served a specific function. It wicked moisture away from the body surface, keeping the skin drier and therefore warmer in cold conditions. The wool layers above it provided the main thermal insulation through their air-trapping fiber structure. The outermost layer, the cloak or the heavy wool overgarment, served as a windbreak, preventing the convective heat loss that wind causes by disrupting the warm air layer maintained against the body by the inner layers. This three-layer system was not designed by a textile engineer. It was developed empirically through the accumulated experience of people who noticed that this combination of materials kept them warmer than other combinations. The specific importance of dry feet and dry extremities in maintaining overall body warmth was understood empirically. People noticed that cold feet made you cold all over, that wet boots made a winter day miserable in ways that dry boots didn't, that the initial discomfort of cold hands progressed rapidly to reduced manual dexterity that made work difficult and dangerous. The greased leather boot, leather treated with tallow or other fats to provide water resistance, was a specific technology for managing this vulnerability, and the regular maintenance of boot leather with grease was a standard element of medieval equipment care. The heat management challenge was not only about staying warm. In summer, the problem reversed, and the management of heat in the workshop, the kitchen, the hayfield, became a different kind of challenge. The medieval person working a forge in summer or baking bread in a clay oven or doing heavy agricultural labor in July heat faced hyperthermia risk in the same way that winter workers faced hypothermia risk, and the strategies for managing excessive heat, working in the early morning before the day's heat peaked, taking rest, breaks in shade, managing clothing to facilitate evaporative cooling while protecting against sunburn, were equally empirically developed and equally sophisticated. Chapter 3. Food without a refrigerator. The Preservation Revolution. Nobody talks about, let's establish something clearly before we go any further. The food situation in medieval England was genuinely impressive. Not impressive in the sense of being luxurious or varied in the way that modern food availability is varied. It was neither of those things for most people most of the time. Impressive in the sense of being a comprehensive multi-technology solution to an engineering problem of significant difficulty. How do you keep food edible for months in a climate that ranges from hot and humid in summer to cold and damp in winter, with no electricity, no refrigeration, no vacuum sealing, no preservatives from a food processing factory, and no way to quickly restock if you get it wrong? The medieval answer to this question was a toolkit of preservation techniques, each with specific applications and specific limitations, developed through centuries of empirical experimentation and refined through accumulated community knowledge. Understanding them is understanding something important about how human ingenuity works. Give people a problem with survival stakes, give them enough generations to experiment with it, and the solutions they develop will be both effective and sophisticated. Salt was the king of medieval food preservation, and its importance was so fundamental that the history of salt is effectively the history of food security across the entire pre-refrigeration period. Salt preserves food through two related mechanisms. First, osmosis. Salt draws moisture out of food and out of the bacteria that would otherwise grow on it, creating an environment that is too dry for most spoilage organisms to function in. Second, ionic disruption. The salt ions directly interfere with the biochemical processes of many bacteria, preventing their reproduction. Together, these mechanisms allow salt to extend the edibility of meat, fish, and vegetables from days to weeks or months. The specific salt preservation techniques of the medieval period varied by the food being preserved. Dry salting, rubbing or coating food directly with salt, was used for thick cuts of meat and fish, the salt forming a crust that gradually penetrated the tissue over days. Brining, immersing food in a salt solution, brine, was used for thinner cuts and for vegetables, the liquid brine ensuring more even penetration. The production of salted herring, which was one of the most important protein foods of medieval Northern Europe, required specific ratios of salt to fish and specific barrel packing techniques that had been developed by the commercial herring fisheries of the North Sea over centuries. The medieval salt trade was consequently one of the most important commercial systems in Europe, generating enough economic value to sustain the cities built around it. The word salary derives from the Latin for salt, salarium, reflecting the historical importance of salt as a commodity of value comparable to wages. The control of salt supplies and salt trade routes was a matter of political importance for medieval states because whoever controlled salt controlled food security. Smoking was the second major preservation technique, and it worked through a combination of mechanisms that were not understood in the medieval period, but were thoroughly exploited in practice. Wood smoke contains hundreds of chemical compounds, many of which have antimicrobial properties. Phenols, aldehydes, organic acids, and various other components that individually and collectively inhibit the growth of bacteria and fungi on the surfaces of smoked food. Simultaneously, the heat of the smoke drying process removes moisture from the surface of the food, and the smoke compounds form a barrier coating that both inhibits microbial growth and slows further moisture absorption. The combination of smoking with salt, the production of smoked, salted bacon and ham from the pigs slaughtered in November, was the primary meat preservation strategy of the medieval peasant household, and the specific techniques of smoking were highly developed. Cold smoking, at temperatures too low to cook the meat, typically below 30 degrees Celsius, produced a preserved product that could be stored for months. Hot smoking, at temperatures that partially cooked the meat, produced a product that was more fully preserved but needed to be consumed sooner. The choice between these techniques and the specific wood used for smoking, different woods produced different flavor profiles, from the mild sweetness of applewood to the sharp intensity of oak, was part of the accumulated knowledge of food preservation that experienced households managed with confidence. The hanging of meat in the smoke of the central hearth, the standard practice of meat preservation in medieval cottages where a purpose-built smokehouse was not available, was not simply primitive. It was a continuous, low-intensity smoking process that took place over weeks and months as the fire burned below, gradually depositing the preservative compounds of wood smoke onto the hanging meat. The blackened beams and the blackened hanging meats of a medieval cottage interior, which seem aesthetically unpleasant to modern eyes, were the visual evidence of a continuous food preservation process that worked effectively and required no additional fuel or management beyond the existing domestic fire. Fermentation was the third major preservation technology, and its medieval applications were broader than most people realize. The most obvious fermented medieval foods are ale and wine. Drinks produced by the controlled fermentation of grain sugars or fruit sugars by yeasts, which converts those sugars to alcohol and carbon dioxide. The alcohol produced by fermentation inhibits the growth of pathogenic bacteria, making fermented drinks safer than the water sources they replaced. This was not understood in terms of microbiology. The germ theory of disease was centuries in the future, but it was understood empirically. People who drank ale got fewer waterborne illnesses than people who drank untreated water, and that observation was sufficient to drive the adoption of fermented drinks as the standard beverage. But fermentation was applied to foods as well. The production of soured milk, the controlled fermentation of milk by lactic acid bacteria, producing yogurt, soured cream, and the various soft cheeses that resulted from further processing, was standard dairy practice. The lactic acid produced by the fermenting bacteria dropped the pH of the milk to levels that inhibited the growth of more dangerous pathogens, preserving the food while simultaneously producing the specific sour flavors that the medieval palate had developed around. Fermented vegetable preparations, similar to modern sauerkraut, produced by packing shredded vegetables with salt and allowing the naturally occurring lactobacillus bacteria on the vegetable surfaces to ferment the mixture. Preserved cabbage and other vegetables through the winter with a combination of salt and lactic acid preservation. Cheese was arguably the most sophisticated product of medieval dairy fermentation. The production of aged cheese involved controlled fermentation by specific microbial communities, the enzymatic breakdown of proteins through the action of rennet, the management of moisture and salt levels, and the creation of specific environmental conditions for aging. Temperature, humidity, air circulation that allowed beneficial molds and bacteria to develop while preventing the growth of spoilage organisms. A well-made, aged hard cheese could remain edible for months or years, concentrating the nutritional value of milk into a portable, durable, high-calorie food that could sustain people through winter when fresh dairy was unavailable. The specific cheese-making knowledge of medieval monasteries was often genuinely sophisticated. Monks had the institutional continuity. A monastery could maintain cheese-making traditions across generations of practitioners. The economic incentive, good cheese was a valuable product, and the specific environmental features, the cool, stable temperature and humidity of a stone cellar was ideal for cheese aging, to develop the art of cheesemaking to a high level. Several modern European cheese traditions, Gruyere, Gouda, various English territorial cheeses, have origins in medieval monastic or regional farm practice. Drying was the fourth major preservation technique, and its applications ranged from the simple, drying sliced apples or plums in the sun, to the highly processed, the production of dried stockfish from cod, which required specific atmospheric conditions and specific processing techniques to achieve the multi-year shelf life that made it the most traded preserved food in Northern European commerce. The drying of herbs, for both culinary and medicinal use, was a crucial domestic activity that was managed with considerable sophistication. Different herbs required different drying conditions. Some needed to be dried quickly in good airflow. To prevent molding, others needed slow, gentle drying to preserve specific volatile compounds that would be driven off by excessive heat. The timing of harvest for drying, different herbs at different stages of their growth cycle, harvested at the specific moment when their active compounds were at maximum concentration, was knowledge that was transmitted carefully through the community, from experienced practitioners to apprentices, and from mothers to daughters. The cellar was the medieval food storage technology that most closely approximated the function of a modern refrigerator. Not in temperature, a cellar is not as cold as a refrigerator, but in its provision of a stable, cool, dark environment that slowed the processes of decay. Root vegetables, carrots, parsnips, turnips, beets, could be stored in cool, slightly moist conditions for months without significant deterioration. Apples and pears, stored in cool conditions without touching each other. Contact between fruits accelerates the ethylene-induced ripening and decay that would otherwise be slowed by the cool temperature, could remain edible for weeks or months beyond their natural season. The management of the cellar was a genuine skill that involved understanding the specific storage requirements of different foods. Too dry, and vegetables lost moisture and became unpalatable. Too wet, and mold developed. Too warm, and decay accelerated. The optimal conditions for root vegetable storage: cool, around 0 to 5 degrees Celsius, slightly humid, dark, well ventilated, were maintained in a well-built cellar, largely through the design of the cellar itself, rather than through active management, but the knowledge of which foods could be stored together. Some foods, like apples, produce ethylene gas that accelerates the ripening of nearby produce. Keeping apples in a separate area of the cellar from other stored produce extended the life of both, and which needed separation was the kind of specific empirical knowledge that made the difference between a cellar that maintained its stores through winter and one that produced rotting food in December. The preservation of fats, the tallow from slaughtered animals, the lard from pigs, the butter from summer dairy production, was accomplished through several methods. Clarified butter, butter that had been carefully melted and had its water and milk solids removed, leaving nearly pure butterfat, could be stored for considerably longer than fresh butter because the removal of the milk solids eliminated the fastest spoiling components. Butter potted with salt, packed tightly into ceramic crocks with salt layered between the butter, lasted through winter in conditions where unsalted fresh butter would have become rancid within days. The confiting of meat, cooking it in its own fat, and then sealing it under a layer of fat, was a preservation technique that the medieval kitchen used primarily for poultry and pork, producing a product similar to the modern French confit that could be stored for weeks under the fat seal. The fat layer served as both a sealant, preventing air contact with the cooked meat, which is necessary for the growth of aerobic spoilage organisms, and an antimicrobial barrier. Saturated animal fat is inhospitable to most bacteria. The confited meat, when removed from the fat and reheated, was both preserved and already cooked, a convenience food by the standards of the medieval kitchen. The smoking, salting, fermenting, drying, and cellaring that characterized medieval food preservation were not simply individual techniques, but an integrated system that applied different methods to different foods in different seasons, managing the full annual cycle of production and consumption in a way that minimized waste and maximized the usable life of everything that the farm and garden produced. The knowledge required to manage this system effectively was extensive, practical, and genuinely impressive. The product of generations of accumulated empirical observation about what worked, what didn't, and what the consequences of getting it wrong looked like. Getting it wrong, it should be noted, had real consequences. Bad preservation, the failure to remove enough moisture, the wrong salt concentration, the storage conditions that allowed the wrong organisms to thrive, produced food that was at best unpleasant and at worst genuinely dangerous. Botulism, the severe food poisoning produced by Clostridium botulinum bacteria in anaerobic, low-acid, protein-rich environments, was a real medieval hazard, occurring primarily in poorly preserved meat and fish products, stored in the sealed, oxygen-free conditions that the bacterium preferred. The specific symptoms of botulism, the descending muscle paralysis, the difficulty swallowing and breathing, would have been recognized as a specific pattern of catastrophic illness, following specific foods, and the accumulated community knowledge about which preservation failures produced illness would have transmitted some practical food safety wisdom, even without any understanding of the bacterium responsible. The medieval food preservation system, taken as a whole, was a genuine achievement of practical ingenuity that sustained the medieval population through the annual cycle of abundance and scarcity, with a reliability that in good years was adequate, and sometimes more than adequate. The diversity of preservation techniques meant that no single failure was catastrophic. If the salted pork ran short, there was still the dried fish. If the dried fish was insufficient, there was still the stored grain. If the grain was running low, there were still the root vegetables in the cellar. The system was not perfect. Poor harvests, unexpected weather, the failure of specific preservation batches, the losses to rodents and insects, and the various organisms that competed with humans for stored food. All of these could and did undermine the system in specific years and specific households, but the system was designed with the redundancy and the diversity that made catastrophic failure less likely than the simple failure of any single component would suggest. No electricity required, just knowledge, ingenuity, salt, smoke, time, and the specific human stubbornness that refuses to give up on the food just because it's getting a bit old. Chapter 4. Communication without the internet. How information traveled in a pre-electric world. You need to send a message, not an email, not a text, not a voice note or a tagged post, or a shared document with comments visible in real time to 17 people simultaneously. A message, a piece of information that exists in your head, in your village, in the year 1280, that needs to get to another person who is somewhere else, possibly in the next village, possibly in the next town, possibly in a city several days' journey away, and needs to get there with sufficient accuracy and sufficient speed to be useful rather than merely historical by the time it arrives. You have no telephone. You have no telegraph. You have no postal service in any organized national sense. You have no printing press. That won't arrive for another 170 years. You have no paper in abundance because paper is expensive and most writing is done on parchment, which is more expensive. You may or may not be literate, and even if you are, the person you're sending the message to may not be. What you have instead is your legs, other people's legs, sound, visual signals, the church's communication network, the market's information economy, and the accumulated social infrastructure of a community that has been passing information without technology for 10,000 years before you arrived. This is considerably more than it sounds like. Let's start with the most basic unit of medieval communication, the human messenger. Before the written letter, before the organized postal system, before any intermediary technology at all, the original communication technology was a person who knew something going to find the person who needed to know it, and telling them directly. This sounds primitive. It was, in many respects, remarkably effective. The human messenger had specific advantages over text-based communication that persist even today in contexts where those advantages matter. A messenger who was present at the event they were reporting could convey nuance, context, and interpretation that a written letter could not. The tone of voice, the facial expression, the specific detail that the writer of a letter might not have thought to include, but that the messenger, asked directly, could provide. A messenger could be questioned, could clarify, could return with follow-up information. A messenger who was trusted could convey information whose very transmission was itself meaningful. If Lord X sent his personal herald to Lord Y, the act of sending that specific herald communicated status and urgency that no written letter could replicate. The professional messenger, the nuncio or the courier, was an established occupation in medieval society, employed by lords, monasteries, merchants, and municipalities to carry important communications across significant distances. The speed of professional couriers was genuinely impressive by the standards of pre-modern land transport. A mounted courier on a good road with fresh horses available at intervals could cover 60 to 80 miles per day, which meant that a message from London to York, roughly 200 miles, could arrive in 3 to 4 days. The royal courier system, in England, the proto-postal system that developed around the communication needs of the royal administration, maintained horses at intervals along major routes specifically to enable this speed. The important word in that calculation is mounted. The mounted courier was a specific technological system, horse plus road plus relay stations, where tired horses could be exchanged for fresh ones. The horse was not simply transportation in this context. It was the central component of a communication infrastructure, and the management of horse health, horse availability, and the horse relay stations, the cursus publicus of the Roman Empire, which various medieval states attempted to replicate, with varying success, was a logistical operation of genuine complexity. For ordinary people sending ordinary messages over ordinary distances, not the royal court, not the great lords, not the wealthy merchants with their own messenger networks. The options were more informal and more creative. The traveler who happened to be going in the right direction was recruited as a messenger. The medieval version of "could you give this to them?" that operated as a standard social service among people traveling the same routes. The pilgrimage routes that connected major religious sites across Europe were among the most heavily traveled paths in the medieval world, and the steady flow of pilgrims along these routes created reliable, if slow, information corridors along which messages and news could travel by being passed from one pilgrim to the next. The peddler, the tinker, the traveling merchant, all of these itinerant figures who moved from village to village and town to town, as a feature of their trade, were also, unavoidably, news carriers. They knew things about the places they had been that the people in the next village didn't know, and the exchange of that information was both a social service and, in some cases, a commercial one. Information had value in the medieval world, and the person who arrived in a market with reliable news about a distant situation that affected prices or politics was a person with a tradable commodity. The market itself was one of the most important information nodes in medieval society. The weekly market that most significant medieval towns held was not only an economic institution, it was a communication institution. People who traveled from the surrounding villages and farms to trade were also people who gathered, talked, exchanged news, heard what was happening in other places, and carried that information back home. The market was the internet hub of the medieval communication network, and the information that circulated through it was the same mixture of commercial intelligence, political news, local gossip, and entertainment that circulates through modern social media, just slower and more social. The church bell deserves its own section because it was the primary mass communication technology of the medieval world, capable of conveying specific messages to an entire community simultaneously with a reach of several miles in good conditions. Church bells were not merely a call to worship. They were a comprehensive communication code that used specific patterns of ringing to convey specific messages to everyone within earshot. The calling bell, the regular pattern that summoned the community to mass at specific canonical hours, was the most common message, so familiar that it was perceived not as a communication, but as a background rhythm of daily life, as automatic and unnoticed as the clock chimes of a modern clock tower. But the bell was also used for the alarm, a rapid, continuous ringing that signaled fire, attack, or other immediate emergency requiring the community's attention. The death knell, a slow, specific pattern of ringing that announced a death, and often conveyed, through its specific pattern, the age and sex of the deceased. A set pattern of rings for a man, a different pattern for a woman, a number of strokes indicating the deceased's age. The summoning bell, ringing that called the community not to worship but to assembly, for the announcement of important news, for the gathering required to address a collective crisis. The victory bell, celebratory ringing that announced good news of sufficient importance to share with the whole community. A medieval person who grew up in a community knew the entire bell vocabulary of their church as fluently and as unconsciously as they knew the language. It was part of the sonic landscape of their life, and the specific meaning of each pattern was as immediately legible as a text message to a modern teenager. The bell, in this sense, was a communication technology of extraordinary reach for its period, a single message source that could communicate simultaneously to an entire geographic community, instantly, without any intermediate infrastructure beyond the person pulling the rope. The signal fire, a beacon lit on a high point, extended the geographic reach of visual communication beyond what any voice or bell could achieve. The network of signal beacons that existed along England's coasts and on high points throughout the country was a genuine emergency communication system capable of transmitting an alarm signal from the coast to the interior of the country in hours. The chain of beacon fires that warned of the Spanish Armada in 1588, just after our medieval period, but continuous with medieval practice, could transmit a signal the length of the English coast in a night. Signal beacons operated on a simple binary protocol. Lit means alarm, unlit means normal. This sounds primitively limited, but for the primary use case, warning of invasion or large-scale attack, binary was sufficient. The question being asked was, is there a threat requiring mobilization? And the beacon's lit or unlit state answered it yes or no, with a speed and geographic range that no other available technology could match. More sophisticated visual signaling systems, semaphore, flag codes, the various systems that different military traditions developed for battlefield communication were refinements of this same basic principle, using visible changes in a known, shared code to convey specific messages over distances where voice communication was impossible. The medieval military tradition had flag and banner signaling systems that allowed basic commands to be conveyed across a battlefield, and the heraldic system, the specific colors and symbols of noble families' coats of arms, was in part a visual identification system that allowed combatants to identify allies and enemies at distance. The written letter, when it existed, and when the parties involved had literacy, was the most precise communication technology available in the medieval period. A letter could convey complex, detailed information with the accuracy that oral transmission inevitably degraded. A letter could be preserved, referred back to, used as evidence of agreements made. A letter could be read by multiple people. A letter could convey information that its carrier didn't know. The sealed letter, whose contents were unknown to the messenger carrying it, was one of the earliest examples of privacy in communication. The literacy requirement was a genuine limitation. Most of the medieval population, estimates vary, but perhaps 10 to 15% of the general population could read at any level in the 13th century, concentrated heavily in the clergy, the nobility, and the merchant class, did not have direct access to written communication. Those who couldn't read themselves could pay a scribe, but this introduced a third party into the communication who was privy to its contents, which limited the privacy of written communication to a degree that affected what people were willing to commit to writing. The Church's communication network was one of the most extensive and most reliable information systems in medieval Europe. The hierarchy of the Church, from the parish priest at the base through the bishop, the archbishop, the cardinal, to the pope at the apex, created a structured communication channel that could transmit information from the center to every corner of the Christian world, and from the periphery back to the center, with a reliability and reach that no secular institution could match. The regular correspondence of bishops with the papal curia, the circulation of papal bulls and encyclicals through the diocesan structure, the meetings of church councils that brought ecclesiastics from across Europe together. All of these created information flows that kept the church informed about conditions in its territories in ways that secular governments often envied and attempted to replicate. The wandering friar, the Dominican and Franciscan preachers who from the 13th century traveled constantly through the towns and villages of Europe, was a specific information vector of considerable importance. A friar who had recently been in Paris or Rome or the Rhineland brought with him information about those places that no village had other means of accessing, and the news that circulated through the friar's preaching circuit was a genuine form of communication that served communities starved of external information about a wider world. The oral tradition was the fundamental communication technology that made all of this function, and dismissing it as merely primitive misses what it actually was, a highly developed, highly adapted information storage and transmission system that had been refined over thousands of years of human experience. The techniques of oral tradition, the mnemonic structures of rhythm and rhyme that made information memorable, the repetition and redundancy that reduced transmission errors, the social structures of performance and audience that maintained the tradition, were genuine technologies for managing information without writing. The medieval ballad, the epic poem, the saint's life, the chronicle in verse, these were not simply entertainment. They were information storage systems. The specific events they recorded, the specific genealogies they preserved, the specific lessons they transmitted, all of this information was formatted for oral storage and oral transmission, structured in ways that made it memorable and resistant to corruption. A skilled oral performer who knew the epic tradition of their culture was, in the most literal sense, a living library. The social consequences of the slow, incomplete, lossy nature of medieval communication were profound. A village that heard about a political crisis in the royal court heard about it weeks or months after the fact, in a version that had passed through multiple intermediaries and that contained the accumulated interpretive distortions of each transmission. The understanding of the wider world that a medieval peasant could construct from available information was limited, fragmentary, and often wrong in specific ways. Events that had already resolved were still being discussed as current. Causes were misidentified. Consequences were misattributed. This was not stupidity. It was the inevitable consequence of an information environment with limited bandwidth, high transmission delay, and no correction mechanisms. The same information, poverty in modern terms, is produced by cutting someone off from all news sources. Their understanding of the world rapidly becomes outdated and distorted in specific ways that are systematic rather than random. Medieval people were not more credulous or more ignorant than their modern counterparts as a matter of cognitive capacity. They were operating in an information environment that made certain kinds of knowledge genuinely inaccessible, and their beliefs about the world reflected that environment rather than any failure of their intelligence. The church was the primary mass communication medium for both information and misinformation in the medieval world, and its role as information provider was inseparable from its role as interpreter and filter of that information. The priest who read the epistle from the bishop, the preacher who explained current events through a theological framework, the religious calendar that organized the year's events into a narrative of Christian salvation. These were not simply religious communications, but the primary information delivery system for a population without other reliable access to news from beyond their immediate horizon. Chapter 5. Telling Time Without a Clock. The medieval art of knowing when it is. What time is it? You ask this question if you are a modern person by performing one of several automatic gestures. Glancing at your wrist, pulling out your phone, looking at the corner of your screen, noticing the clock on the microwave as you walk past. The answer arrives in seconds, with a precision down to the minute, without any conscious thought about how you obtained it. You know what time it is the way you know which way is down. As a continuous ambient awareness that costs you nothing and that you never think about. Now remove all of that. Every clock, every watch, every phone, every digital display, every mechanical clock. Remove also the entire cultural framework of precise quantified time. The system of 24 hours each, divided into 60 minutes, each divided into 60 seconds that modern life runs on so thoroughly that the precision itself has become invisible. You cannot tell time to the minute because the infrastructure for doing so does not exist. You cannot tell time to the hour with reliable accuracy because the mechanical clock, while it exists by the later medieval period, is expensive, rare, and confined to church towers and wealthy institutions. What you have instead is a relationship with time that is qualitatively different from the modern relationship. Not worse exactly, not better, but fundamentally different in what it measures, what it values, and what kind of accuracy it achieves. The medieval day was not divided into 24 equal hours. It was divided into 12 hours of day, and 12 hours of night. Canonical hours in the Church's framework, but these hours were not equal in length. They were defined as 1/12 of the daylight period and 1/12 of the night period, respectively, which meant that a summer hour was considerably longer than a winter hour. The concept of the hour as a fixed unit of equal duration, what historians call the equinoctial hour, existed as an astronomical abstraction, but was not the lived experience of time for most medieval people. This was not a deficiency, it was a feature. The medieval variable hour was calibrated to the actual experience of the day, rather than to an abstract mathematical division of it. Saying, "I will meet you at the third hour," communicated something more immediately meaningful than a specific minute count. It said early morning, well after dawn, but before the day is fully underway, in a way that was adjusted to the actual quality of the light and the actual state of the working day, regardless of the season. The meeting time communicated not an abstract number, but a position in the rhythm of the day. The primary time-telling technology of the medieval period was the sun, and the human relationship with solar time was both more intimate and more sophisticated than modern life allows most people to develop. The angle of the sun in the sky, the length and direction of shadows, the quality of the light, the temperature, all of these were continuously available indicators of the time of day that any person who spent significant time outdoors had learned to read from childhood. The shadow as timepiece was the foundation of the sundial, one of the oldest human time measurement technologies, dating back to ancient Egypt. A fixed vertical rod, the gnomon, casts a shadow whose length and direction change predictably with the sun's position, and marking the positions of the shadow at specific times of day on the surface around the gnomon produces an instrument that reads the time from the sun's position. Medieval churches often had simple mass dials scratched into their south-facing walls. Scratched semicircles with radiating lines marking the canonical hours that were functional sundials used to time the daily services. The accuracy of the sundial was adequate for a world that didn't need minute precision. Knowing that it was approximately mid-morning, approximately midday, approximately mid-afternoon, that the service was due, that the noon meal should be prepared, that the working day was about half done, was the functional requirement, and the sundial met it. The water clock, clepsydra, an ancient technology that used the controlled flow of water to measure time, was available in the medieval period and was used in some monastic settings where the canonical hours needed to be kept through the night when the sundial was obviously useless. A vessel with a small hole near the bottom allowed water to drip at a steady rate, and the level of water remaining, or the level in a receiving vessel, indicated the elapsed time. The accuracy of the clepsydra was affected by temperature. Cold water flowed more slowly than warm water, by the consistency of the hole size, which changed with use and with deposits of mineral scale, and by the true starting conditions, and it was never precise in the modern sense, but as a keep me awake for the night office technology, it was adequate. The canonical hours themselves, the 8 times of prayer that structured the monastic day, were the primary time framework for medieval society beyond the monastery, as well as within it. Prime, approximately 6 a.m. Terce, approximately 9 a.m. Sext, approximately noon. None, approximately 3 p.m. Vespers, approximately 6 p.m. And Compline, approximately 9 p.m., plus matins in the middle of the night, and lauds at dawn. These 8 markers were announced to the broader community by the church bell, providing the entire population within earshot with a regular time signal calibrated to the day's natural rhythm. The church bell in this function was a public clock, free to access, impossible to ignore, calibrated by the community's shared religious framework, and accurate to within what the monastic community's own timekeeping technology, initially the water clock, later the mechanical clock, could provide. When the mechanical clock was installed in church towers in the later medieval period, The first documented mechanical clock in England dates to around 1283 at Dunstable Priory. It improved the precision of the bell signal but did not change its basic social function. The bell told the community what time it was, and the community organized its day around the bell. The mechanical clock, when it arrived, was a genuine technological revolution in timekeeping. The escapement mechanism that regulated the release of energy from a wound spring or falling weight, allowing the gear train to advance in controlled steps rather than running freely, was one of the great mechanical inventions of the medieval period. But the early mechanical clocks were not the accurate instruments we associate with the word clock. They had no minute hands. The hour hand alone indicated a precision that the mechanism could not reliably maintain. They needed regular adjustment against a reliable standard, the sundial, where available, and they drifted noticeably between adjustments. The mechanical clock's value in the early period was less about precision than about reliability. A sundial was more accurate than a mechanical clock in fine weather, but a sundial was useless in cloudy weather, at night and indoors. A mechanical clock, or a water clock before it, kept running regardless of weather and light conditions, providing a continuous time signal through the periods when the sun was unavailable. This continuity was the primary advantage, and it was sufficient to make the mechanical clock worth the investment for institutions that needed reliable timekeeping through all conditions. The distinction between natural time and clock time, between the lived experience of the day's rhythm and the abstract quantified equinoctial time that the mechanical clock eventually imposed, was one of the deepest cultural transformations of the transition from medieval to modern life. And it was a transformation that took centuries to complete. The medieval person who worked from sunrise to sunset was working in natural time. Their work schedule was calibrated to the light rather than to an abstract number, and the variation in their working day between summer and winter was simply the variation that the natural world provided. The modern worker, whose shift begins at 9 o'clock regardless of whether it's June or December, is working in clock time, a time that is independent of the natural world, and that requires artificial light, electricity, to make the darker months compatible with the fixed schedule. The agricultural calendar was the other primary time framework for rural medieval life. The year was divided not into months with abstract numbers, but into a sequence of agricultural events: plowing, planting, haymaking, harvest, gleaning, fallowing, the November slaughter, that were themselves time markers. When the plowing is done, and after harvest, communicated temporal information that was meaningful to anyone embedded in the agricultural cycle, because those events happened at approximately the same time each year, driven by the same seasonal cues. The agricultural calendar was a time system calibrated to the work that needed to be done rather than to an abstract division of the year. The seasonal festivals of the medieval calendar, the combination of Christian saints' days and pre-Christian seasonal celebrations that had been absorbed into the Christian calendar, provided additional time markers at roughly month-level intervals through the year. Candlemas, Lady Day, Midsummer, Lammas, Michaelmas, All Saints, Christmas. These were the temporal landmarks of the medieval year, and knowing that it was just after Michaelmas communicated as much temporal information as a specific date, in a form that was immediately meaningful to anyone who knew the calendar. The night sky was another time technology that medieval people, who spent more time outdoors at night than modern people and whose eyes were better adapted to the dark through necessity, could read with an intimacy that most modern people have lost. The rotation of the night sky was a giant slow clock whose hands were the stars, and a person who knew the sky well could estimate the time of night from the position of specific stars and constellations with reasonable accuracy. Sailors and travelers who navigated by night needed this knowledge practically, and the tradition of celestial time reading was embedded in the navigation culture of the medieval period. The star clock, the specific technique of using the circumpolar stars, the stars near the celestial pole that never set below the horizon in temperate latitudes, to tell time through the night, allowed an experienced observer to estimate the time with an accuracy of roughly an hour. Polaris, the North Star, and the stars that rotate around it in a predictable circle through the night, provided a continuous, celestial clock face that required no technology beyond the educated human eye to read. What does all of this add up to? A timekeeping system that was less precise than the modern one, organized around natural and social rhythms rather than abstract quantities, adequate for the actual needs of the activities it supported, and maintained through a combination of observation skills, community infrastructure, and institutional investment that was both practical and genuinely sophisticated. The medieval person who didn't know what time it was, in the modern sense, was not temporally disoriented. They knew where they were in the day. Early morning, mid-morning, noon, afternoon, evening, with a precision that was sufficient for every activity they needed to coordinate. They knew where they were in the year. What season, what phase of the agricultural cycle, what position in the liturgical calendar, with a completeness and a richness that modern life, detached from seasonal rhythms, rarely provides. What they didn't know was a specific number, and the specific number was not something their world required. Time without a clock was not timelessness. It was a different relationship with time. More embodied, more seasonal, more social, more tied to the rhythms of the natural world. Whether it was better or worse than the modern relationship with quantified clock time is a question worth sitting with rather than dismissing. Chapter 6. Work without power tools. The mechanical genius of the pre-electric workshop. Here's a thing that modern people consistently underestimate about the pre-electric world. It was not simply a world of manual labor. It was a world of mechanical ingenuity. A world that had developed, through centuries of empirical engineering, a range of mechanical devices for converting natural energy sources into useful work that was sophisticated, effective, and in many cases genuinely impressive. The false image of the medieval craftsperson is of someone doing everything by hand, muscle against material, brute force as the primary tool. The real image is considerably more interesting. Someone who had thought carefully about leverage, about gearing, about the properties of water and wind as energy sources, and who had developed machines, real machines with moving parts and mechanical advantage and power transmission that could perform work at scales that no human muscle could achieve unaided. Let's start with the watermill, because it is both the most important mechanical technology of the medieval period and the one that most directly replaces what would, in a modern setting, be done with an electric motor. The watermill converted the kinetic energy of flowing water into rotary mechanical motion, and it did this with an efficiency that, in a good installation on a strong river, could generate many horsepower of continuous mechanical work without any fuel cost beyond the infrastructure investment of the mill itself. The millstone turned by a watermill, grinding grain into flour, was doing work that would otherwise require hours of human or animal labor for each batch of grain, and doing it at a scale and a speed that no manual grinder could approach. The spread of the watermill through medieval Europe was one of the most significant technological developments of the period. The Domesday Book of 1086 records over 5,600 watermills in England alone, one for approximately every 50 households, a saturation of mechanical power infrastructure that represented an enormous investment and an enormous productivity gain. By the 13th century, the watermill had been adapted beyond grain grinding to a range of other industrial applications, fulling mills, using water power to drive heavy hammers that beat woolen cloth to felt and clean it. Sawmills, using water power to drive reciprocating saws through timber, bellows for iron smelting, hammers for metalworking, and various other industrial applications. The engineering of the watermill was genuinely sophisticated. The basic water wheel, horizontal or vertical, undershot, driven by the water flowing under the wheel, or overshot, driven by water falling over the top of the wheel, required careful hydraulic engineering to function efficiently. The mill race that directed water to the wheel needed to be designed for the right flow rate and head, height of water drop. The wheel itself needed to be appropriately sized for the power available. The gearing that converted the wheel's rotation to the millstone's rotation needed to be designed with the right ratios to produce the right millstone speed for optimal grinding. None of this was done with formal engineering calculations. It was done by millwrights, whose knowledge was accumulated through experience and transmitted through apprenticeship, but the knowledge was real, and the skill was genuine. The windmill, which appears in Europe from the 12th century onward, spreading rapidly through areas where rivers were insufficient for watermills, extended the mechanical power of the wind-driven rotation to the same range of industrial applications that the watermill served. The windmill was actually a more complex engineering challenge than the watermill in some respects. Unlike the watermill, which faced a predictable, consistent flow of water, the windmill had to deal with wind that came from different directions at different speeds, requiring either a mechanism to rotate the entire mill to face into the wind, the post mill in which the entire structure rotated on a central post, or a mechanism to rotate only the cap and sail assembly, the tower mill, which developed later and allowed the main structure to be more substantial and stable. The millwright who maintained and operated a medieval mill was one of the most skilled tradespeople in the medieval economy, capable of diagnosing mechanical problems, machining wooden components to close tolerances, managing the hydraulic engineering of the mill race, and maintaining the complex mechanical system of gears, shafts, and bearings that made the mill function. The mill was the most mechanically complex device in most medieval communities, and the miller who managed it occupied a position of both practical importance and social significance. He was the person who converted the community's grain into the flour that made the bread that fed everyone, using a machine of considerable sophistication. The blacksmith's forge was another center of mechanical sophistication that the popular image of a sweating blacksmith hammering hot iron does not fully capture. The bellows that maintain the forge fire at temperatures sufficient for iron working, the specific temperatures, hundreds of degrees Celsius, required to bring iron to a workable state, was a mechanical device of considerable effectiveness, designed to deliver a continuous, high-volume stream of air with each stroke. The large double bellows, the two-chamber design that delivers air on both strokes of the mechanism, eliminating the pulsation that a single-chamber bellows produces, was a medieval innovation in bellows technology that substantially improved the consistency and temperature of the forge fire. The water wheel-driven hammer, the trip hammer, was a mechanical device that used a cam on the water wheel's axle to lift and drop a heavy iron hammer repeatedly, performing the work of forging and drawing iron at a scale and pace that no human smith could match. The trip hammer allowed medieval ironmasters to work iron in quantities that made it practical to produce iron tools and implements at scales that would have been impossible with purely manual smithing. The ironworking centers of medieval Europe, the Weald of Kent and Sussex in England, the Forest of Dean, the Rhineland in Germany, used water-powered trip hammers as a central production technology, and the output of these centers in terms of iron tools, agricultural implements, and structural iron was the foundation of the medieval material economy. The lathe was another pre-electric machine that enabled precision manufacturing of wooden objects. The pole lathe, the simplest medieval lathe design, using a spring pole, a flexible branch attached overhead, connected by a cord to a foot treadle, turning the workpiece in alternate directions as the treadle was depressed and released, was simple in concept but effective in practice, capable of turning wooden vessels, chair legs, tool handles, and various other components with a precision and speed that hand carving could not approach. The bodger, the woodland craftsperson who worked with a pole lathe to produce chair components and other turned wooden goods, was a common figure in the woodlands of medieval England, operating a portable lathe that could be set up in the forest near the timber supply. The mechanism of the pole lathe is worth describing in detail because it illustrates a principle of medieval mechanical engineering that appears repeatedly: the intelligent exploitation of the elastic properties of natural materials to store and release energy. The bent spring pole stored elastic potential energy when the foot treadle pulled the cord, and therefore the pole, down. When the treadle was released, the pole sprang back upward, unwinding the cord and reversing the rotation of the workpiece. The craftsperson's cutting tool, a gouge or chisel, was applied to the wood only on the forward stroke, when the treadle was depressed and the wood rotated toward the tool, lifted clear on the return stroke. The result was intermittent cutting, somewhat less efficient than the continuous rotation of a modern electric lathe, but entirely effective for the range of turning operations the medieval craftsperson needed. The great wheel, the large spinning wheel used for spinning wool, was a powered tool in the sense of being a mechanical device that provided significant mechanical advantage to the spinner, converting the small, fast motion of the driving wheel into the slower, more powerful rotation of the spindle, at a ratio that allowed the spinner to twist and draw the wool fibers into thread at rates that were substantially faster than the hand spindle they replaced. The spinning wheel arrived in Europe from the Islamic world in the 13th century and represented a significant productivity improvement in textile production, one of the most economically important industries of medieval Europe. The printing press, strictly speaking, just passed the edge of our medieval period. Gutenberg's press dates to approximately 1440, but a useful illustration of the mechanical principles in play was itself a mechanical device adapted from the existing screw press technology used for olive oil and wine production. The screw press, which converted rotary motion into linear pressure through a threaded mechanism, had been used in olive oil and winemaking since antiquity. Gutenberg's insight was to apply this existing mechanical technology to the new context of movable type printing. The mechanical principles were already understood and proven, and the innovation was in the specific application rather than in the underlying mechanism. The carpenter's toolkit of the medieval period was more mechanically sophisticated than modern people typically imagine. The brace and bit, a rotary drilling tool that used a cranked handle to convert the small, continuous circular motion of the operator's hand into the rotation of the drill bit, provided an enormous mechanical advantage in drilling holes compared to the earlier technique of rotating a straight bit between the palms. And the specific design of the brace, the offset crank that moved in a circle while the central chuck remained relatively stationary, was a genuine mechanical insight. The frame saw, the draw knife, the spoke shave, the adze, each of these carpenter's tools embodied specific mechanical principles that gave the craftsperson mechanical advantage over the raw material. The mechanical sophistication of medieval construction, the large cranes that lifted heavy stone blocks to the heights of cathedral walls and towers, the centering, temporary wooden structures that supported the weight of stone arches during construction until the keystone was in place, the mechanical systems for mixing and transporting mortar at the scale of a major building project was extraordinary. The construction of a major medieval cathedral was a project of enormous mechanical and organizational complexity, producing structures that were engineering achievements at the limits of what the available materials and understanding of structural mechanics could achieve, and occasionally beyond those limits, which is why some cathedrals collapsed and had to be rebuilt. The horse itself was a power tool, a biological machine of considerable output, more powerful than an ox for draft purposes, and capable of sustained work, at a pace that made it the primary mechanical power source for land transport and, where horses rather than oxen were used, for plowing. The development of the horse collar. The rigid collar that transferred the draft force from the horse's neck to its shoulders, preventing the choking that the older throat and girth harness caused, and allowing the horse to exert its full pulling power, was one of the most important mechanical innovations of the early medieval period, substantially increasing the effective power output of the horse as a draft animal. The leverage of a simple hand tool, the axe, the adze, the mattock, was itself a mechanical principle that the medieval craftsperson understood and exploited through the specific design of their tools. The handle length, the weight distribution, the specific geometry of the cutting edge, All of these were variables that medieval toolmakers optimized through generations of experience to maximize the mechanical advantage that the tool provided. A well-made medieval axe was not simply an iron blade on a wooden stick. It was a precisely designed mechanical device whose specific proportions, the length and curvature of the handle, the weight and shape of the head, the angle and geometry of the cutting edge, had been refined through centuries of use and feedback to optimize its performance for its specific application. The medieval workshop, in summary, was not a place of brute force and manual drudgery. It was a place of mechanical intelligence, a workspace in which the craftsperson's understanding of lever, gear, cam, wedge, screw, and the properties of water and wind as energy sources was applied to produce work that exceeded what unaugmented human muscle could achieve. The absence of electricity did not mean the absence of power. It meant the use of different power sources, managed with different but genuine mechanical sophistication. The tools produced in these workshops, the iron plows that turned the heavy clay soils of Northern Europe, the grinding stones that converted grain to flour, the cutting blades that harvested grain and shaped wood and worked leather, were the mechanical foundation on which medieval civilization's productive capacity rested. They were made without electricity. They were designed without formal engineering. They were produced and maintained by craftspeople whose knowledge was empirical rather than theoretical. And they worked and worked well, and enabled a civilization of considerable complexity to function and to build, and to produce things of lasting beauty and lasting utility. Chapter 7. Entertainment. Without screens, the medieval art of having fun. You have been working since before dawn. You have ground grain, tended animals, worked a field, hauled water, managed the preservation of last week's slaughtered pig, argued with your neighbor about the boundary of your respective strips in the open field, and repaired the leather on your shoe, which chose today of all days to begin separating from its sole. The light is fading. The fire is banked. The children are beginning to make the sounds of children who are tired and in need of management. You have earned the evening, and the evening in medieval England in 1280 offered more options than you might think. Not screens. Let's establish that clearly. Not television, not cinema, not the internet, not video games, not the scroll through social media that modern evenings tend to dissolve into with the easy gravity of a habit that was formed before you quite noticed it forming. None of that. But the human need for entertainment, for distraction, for the pleasures of story and music and social competition, and the specific relaxation that comes from being actively engaged in something enjoyable rather than merely passive. That need was as real in 1280 as it is now, and it was met with genuine creativity and genuine skill. Music was the entertainment technology that required the least infrastructure and the most developed skill, and it was consequently the most universal. Every culture in human history has developed music, song, rhythm, the organized manipulation of sound for aesthetic pleasure. And medieval European culture was no exception. The music of the medieval peasant, not the formal polyphony of the cathedral choir or the composed works of the troubadour tradition, but the folk music of village life, was a living tradition of songs, dances, and instrumental music passed down orally through communities and adapted continuously as it traveled and as it met new circumstances. The carol, which, in its original medieval meaning, was not a Christmas song specifically, but a round dance song, a song for dancing in a circle, was one of the primary popular musical forms, and it was music designed for participation rather than for passive listening. A circle of people singing and dancing together to a carol was not an audience watching a performance. They were all performers, all active, all generating the music together. The social bonding of this collective musical activity, the synchronization of breath and movement, the shared emotional experience, the physical pleasure of dancing, served the same community cohesion functions that modern research on music and social bonding has confirmed. The specific instruments of medieval popular music were not elaborate or expensive. The tabor, a small drum, and the pipe, a three-holed recorder that could be played with one hand while the other played the tabor, was a combination that a single musician could manage, providing both rhythm and melody for dancing. The fiddle, a bowed stringed instrument, the ancestor of the modern violin, though considerably cruder in its construction and darker in its sound, was the primary melodic instrument of the medieval folk tradition. The hurdy-gurdy, a mechanical instrument that used a rosined wheel turned by a crank to sound the strings continuously, with keys pressed to change the pitch, was popular enough to be both an instrument of wandering musicians and a subject of medieval art. These instruments were within reach of communities without substantial wealth. The tabor and pipe together cost less than a week's skilled labor wages. The fiddle was more expensive, but durable enough to last decades with care. The skill to play them was acquired through apprenticeship to more experienced players, and the tradition of music making was transmitted through communities in the same way that other practical skills were transmitted, through watching, imitating, practicing, and receiving correction from more experienced practitioners. Storytelling was the evening entertainment that required the least technology, literally nothing beyond a human voice and an audience. And the medieval oral narrative tradition was a sophisticated art form with its own conventions, techniques, and practitioners. The traveling storyteller who came through the village was a significant entertainment event, someone who brought stories from elsewhere, whose performance brought familiar narrative forms to new content and new audiences. But storytelling was not exclusively the province of specialists. It was a generalist skill that any community member could contribute to at various levels of sophistication. The specific narrative traditions of medieval popular culture, the folk tale, the legend, the saint's life, the romance, were not simply entertainment. They were the primary medium through which values, moral frameworks, cautionary examples, and communal identity were transmitted through oral culture. A story about a clever peasant who outwits a greedy lord was not merely amusing. It was a piece of cultural information about the relationship between clever peasants and greedy lords, expressed in a form memorable enough to be repeated, transmitted, and applied to new situations. The entertainment and the instruction were inseparable in the oral narrative tradition, and the most entertaining stories were often the most instructive, precisely because the entertainment made them memorable. Games occupied a central place in medieval leisure, and the range of medieval games was more extensive than most modern people realize. Board games, chess tables, an ancestor of backgammon. Nine Men's Morris, a strategic game played on a specific board pattern. Various Mancala-type games were played across all social levels. The simplicity of the equipment, a board scratched into a piece of wood, pebbles as playing, pieces, meant that board games were accessible to any household with the knowledge of the rules, and the intellectual engagement of strategic game playing provided the kind of active mental stimulation that passive entertainment cannot. The carved game boards found scratched into the cloister floors of English monasteries are among the most touching physical artifacts of medieval leisure. The evidence that monks, supposedly devoted entirely to prayer and work, found enough time between the canonical hours to scratch a game of Nine Men's Morris into the stone and play it with their fellows. The boredom of the cloistered life and the human need for mental engagement that games address is as legible in those scratched patterns as anything written in the monastery's library. Outdoor games were a major component of medieval leisure, particularly for the young. The ball games of the medieval period, the various forms of village football that were being played in English villages from at least the 12th century, were considerably more chaotic than modern football, but recognizably the same impulse. Two groups competing to move an object in opposite directions across a defined space. Medieval village football had almost no rules, could involve entire villages competing over considerable distances, and was celebrated with a physical intensity that periodically required royal prohibitions because it was distracting men from archery practice, which the crown considered more important. Archery itself was both a military training requirement and a leisure activity in medieval England. The English longbow, a weapon of extraordinary power and accuracy in trained hands, required years of practice to use effectively, and the training culture built around it produced communities of skilled archers who competed regularly in informal and formal contexts. The butts, the archery targets set up at specific distances, were a feature of most English villages, and the Sunday afternoon archery practice that royal decree mandated specifically to ensure a supply of trained longbowmen for military purposes was simultaneously a social event, a competitive sport, and a skilled leisure activity. Wrestling was universal, a physical competition that required no equipment beyond two willing participants and a defined space that provided the physical engagement and competitive stimulation that all social mammals seem to require, and that was part of the leisure culture of every social level from peasant to noble. The specific wrestling traditions of different regions, the specific holds, the specific rules, the specific scoring criteria varied, but the basic activity was a constant presence in the leisure landscape of medieval Europe. The specific leisure institutions of the medieval community deserve attention as examples of how social organization can create entertainment infrastructure without any physical technology. The feast day. The celebration of a saint's day or a religious festival was a community leisure event organized by social tradition rather than by any physical plant. The entire community came together. Food and drink were provided from community resources. Music and games and various forms of communal activity occupied the day, and the result was a leisure event of considerable scale and genuine pleasure that required essentially no infrastructure beyond the community itself and its accumulated social practices. The tavern, the alehouse, where communal drinking and socializing occurred, was the primary indoor leisure institution for adult men in most medieval communities. The alehouse did not serve the same purpose as a modern bar. Exactly because the ale sold in medieval taverns was considerably lower in alcohol than modern beer. The standard small ale of everyday consumption was a very low alcohol fermented beverage, more nutritional supplement than intoxicant. Drinking at the tavern was primarily a social activity, the gathering of neighbors in a warm, lit space, the exchange of news and gossip, the playing of games, the occasional music, rather than primarily an intoxication activity, though stronger ales and wines were available for those who wanted them, and the social problems of excessive drinking were recognized and complained about throughout the medieval period. The specific importance of the harvest feast, the communal celebration at the end of the harvest season, when the agricultural year's most urgent and most demanding work was complete, as a leisure institution cannot be overstated. The harvest feast was one of the most important social events of the agricultural year, bringing the entire community together in a celebration that served multiple functions simultaneously, expressing gratitude for the harvest, reinforcing community bonds that would be called upon through the winter's mutual aid requirements, celebrating the successful completion of collective labor, and providing a release of the accumulated tension of the harvest's urgency in a context of collective pleasure. The Morris dance, the specific English folk dance tradition associated with various seasonal celebrations, is one of the surviving artifacts of medieval leisure culture, whose origins are genuinely medieval, even if its fully documented history begins somewhat later. The combination of physical skill, the specific leaping and stepping patterns of Morris dancing, social coordination, the requirement for multiple dancers to work together in precise patterns. Music, the tabor and pipe or fiddle providing the driving rhythm, and visual spectacle, the colorful costumes and the bells attached to the dancers' legs, produced a leisure activity that was simultaneously athletic, social, musical, and theatrical. What all of this adds up to is an entertainment culture that was active rather than passive, participatory rather than spectatorial, social rather than individual, and embedded in the community's life rather than detached from it. Medieval entertainment did not happen to you while you sat still. You made it, with your neighbors, with your voice and your body, and your accumulated skill at games and music and dance and story, in the specific social context of a community whose bonds were strengthened by the very act of entertaining itself together. This is not an argument that medieval entertainment was better than modern entertainment. The range and quality and accessibility of modern entertainment options, the entire recorded history of human music, available instantly, the entire history of cinema, the full range of global literature, the unlimited interactive entertainment of games, is not something that a medieval feast can replicate, and pretending otherwise would be dishonest. But it is an argument that the medieval entertainment culture, built entirely without electricity and entirely without technology beyond the instruments and the game boards, was not a pale substitute for entertainment, but a genuine, rich, satisfying response to the human need for play, story, music, and the specific pleasure of doing enjoyable things with other people. The people who participated in it were not wishing they had television. They were having fun in the specific forms their culture had developed, for having fun with the specific pleasures and the specific social rewards that those forms provided. Chapter 8: Medicine without modern science. How medieval people understood the body. You are sick. This happens in medieval life, with a frequency and a variety that makes the modern experience of illness, the occasional cold, the rare bacterial infection quickly resolved with antibiotics, the chronic conditions managed by pharmaceutical intervention, look almost trivial by comparison. Illness in medieval England was a constant companion, not just in the catastrophic, epidemic sense. The Black Death killed perhaps a third of Europe's population in the 1340s, but that was a specific catastrophic event rather than daily life, but in the grinding, persistent sense of bodies operating in an environment of genuine physical challenge. The cold, the inadequate diet at the end of winter, the intestinal parasites that virtually everyone in the medieval period carried as a biological constant, the infections from wounds and from dental problems, and from contaminated water, the occupational injuries of agricultural and craft work, the specific diseases of childhood, the obstetric complications that made childbirth genuinely dangerous, the arthritis and musculoskeletal damage of decades of heavy physical labor. All of these constituted a medical landscape of genuine difficulty, and the medieval response to it, without the tools of modern medicine, was a combination of the empirically effective, the genuinely harmful, and the merely theatrical, that is, interesting precisely because you can trace the logic of each. We have discussed medieval medicine in other scripts, in the winter survival video particularly, and so this chapter will focus specifically on the pre-electric, pre-modern aspects of medieval healthcare, what it looked like without any of the technology we associate with modern medicine, what actually worked, what didn't, and why. The medieval understanding of the body was based on the Greek medical tradition of Galen and Hippocrates, transmitted through the medieval period in Latin translation, and organized around the theory of the four humors. This framework, blood, phlegm, yellow bile, black bile, each with specific qualities and each requiring balance for health, was wrong in its fundamental premises, but was the organizing theory from which medieval medicine derived its treatments. We know it was wrong because we can test its predictions against the outcomes of the treatments it generated. And many of those treatments, bloodletting, purging, dietary manipulation based on humoral theory, were harmful rather than helpful. But within this wrong framework, there was a layer of genuine empirical knowledge that worked independently of the theory, accumulated through centuries of observation about which plants produced which effects on which conditions. The herbal medicine of the medieval period, the knowledge of which preparations to use for which symptoms, transmitted through written herbals and through oral tradition, contained genuine pharmacological activity alongside the ineffective and the harmful. Willow bark for pain and fever, the aspirin connection. Garlic for infection, the allicin connection. Honey for wounds, the hygroscopic and peroxide connection. Thyme for cough, the thymal connection. These are not folk superstitions. They are empirically identified pharmaceutical effects that happen to align with modern pharmacology's findings, discovered not through controlled trials, but through the accumulated observation of millions of people treating themselves over centuries. The surgical tradition of the medieval period was, in some specific applications, genuinely impressive. The military surgeons who accompanied armies, men of practical experience whose skill was developed in the most demanding clinical environment possible, developed techniques for wound management, for arrow and bolt extraction, for the management of fractures that were effective within the limits of what was possible without anesthesia and without antisepsis. The specific techniques of wound irrigation, of leaving certain wounds open to drain rather than closing them, of managing amputation when infection made it necessary. These were developed empirically in a context where the feedback between technique and outcome was immediate and severe. The specific innovation of the medieval hospital, the institution that provided care for the sick poor, managed by religious orders who saw the care of the ill as a spiritual obligation, was a significant development in the social provision of healthcare. The hospital was not a medical institution in the modern sense. It did not provide medical treatment in the therapeutic sense that modern hospitals do. It provided nursing care, a warm bed, regular food, clean water, the continuous attention of a caregiver, which is, for a wide range of illnesses, the most important contribution to recovery that any institution can make. The care of a sick person in a medieval hospital was better, in many respects, than the care they could have received at home, not because the hospital had better medicines, but because it had the resources to provide what the illness required: sustained, competent nursing attention to the patient's comfort, nutrition, hydration, and general care. For conditions that modern medicine treats with specific pharmacological interventions, medieval hospital care was insufficient. For conditions where recovery is primarily a matter of the body's own mechanisms being supported with adequate rest, nutrition, and warmth, which is a much larger category of illness than modern pharmaceutical culture sometimes implies. The medieval hospital was effective. The midwife, the specialist in childbirth management, was the healthcare provider most important to the survival of medieval women and infants, and the accumulated practical knowledge of experienced midwives was genuinely sophisticated within the limits of what was possible without modern obstetric intervention. The management of labor, the physical positioning of the mother, the support of the perineum to reduce tearing, the management of the placenta and the cord, the assessment of fetal position, and the management of abnormal presentations was knowledge accumulated through hundreds or thousands of attended births, transmitted through the apprenticeship system that trained new midwives under experienced ones. Where the midwife could not help was in the specific emergencies that required surgical intervention, the severe postpartum hemorrhage that required modern transfusion capability, the obstructed labor that required cesarean section, the septic complications that required antibiotics. These situations were the ones where medieval obstetric outcomes were worst, and they accounted for the elevated maternal mortality that made childbirth genuinely dangerous in the pre-modern period. The midwife's skill was real and valuable, and it made a difference to outcomes. It was not sufficient to address every complication. The community's health knowledge, distributed through the population rather than concentrated in specialists, was another significant layer of the medieval healthcare system. Every household managed minor illness, injury, and the routine health challenges of daily life through a combination of traditional remedies, practical nursing care, and the social support of the community. The knowledge required for this, the specific preparations for common ailments, the first aid for occupational injuries, the management of childhood illnesses, the recognition of when a situation required specialist attention, was transmitted through the community's oral tradition and through the practical training of childhood in households where illness and its management were regular features of life. Conclusion: what the dark taught them. It is late. The fire is burning low. The children are asleep. The rushlight you lit 3 hours ago has burned to its end. And the choice is between lighting another and going to bed. You go to bed. You lie in the dark, the real dark, the structural dark of a world without electric light. And you listen to the sounds of a village that is settling into its night. The cattle shift in their end of the longhouse. The wind moves through the thatch. Somewhere outside, a dog that has not yet been taught to be quiet is being quiet by degrees. The coals in the hearth are still orange, visible from across the room. The small, persistent glow of managed fire that has been the center of your household's life for every day of your existence. You have managed an entire day without electricity. You have managed it the way medieval people managed it, through knowledge, through community, through the accumulated wisdom of generations of people solving the same problems with ingenuity and patience, and the specific human talent for turning constraints into solutions. The rushlight that pushed back the dark was not a failure to have a light bulb. It was a solution to the problem of darkness, made from materials that the landscape provided, with skill that any household could acquire. The banked fire that kept the house warm overnight was not a failure to have a thermostat. It was a sophisticated management of combustion chemistry, executed by people who understood fire with an intimacy that most modern people have never needed to develop. The food in your cellar, the salt pork in the barrel, the smoked ham hanging in the rafters, the dried herbs in their bundles, all of it is a triumph of practical chemistry, applied without any knowledge of chemistry, through the empirical intelligence of people who knew what worked because they had tried what didn't and learned from the consequences. The message you sent to the next village went with the miller's boy who was going there anyway. The time you needed to know was told to you by the church bell, which is never wrong about whether it's midday. The story you told your children before they slept was the same story your grandmother told you, and her grandmother told her. The same shape of narrative, worn smooth by generations of telling, still capable of making a child's eyes go wide in the firelight. The world without electricity was a world that required more from the people in it. Still, more physical engagement, more practical knowledge, more active management of the basic conditions of life. It was also a world that gave more back, a more intimate relationship with the materials of the physical world, a deeper knowledge of the natural rhythms that most modern people experience only as background, a more direct connection to the community on whose collective knowledge and collective labor the individual's survival genuinely depended. Was it better than modern life? No. The mortality rates were higher. The physical discomfort was greater. The range of available experience was dramatically smaller. The specific catastrophes, the failed harvest, the epidemic, the difficult birth, were more common and more lethal. Nobody who honestly understood both options would choose the medieval one, but it was not the diminished, degraded, waiting for electricity existence that the popular account implies. It was a complete life, organized around a different relationship with light and heat and food and time and work and entertainment and each other. A life that had found, through centuries of accumulated ingenuity, solutions to every problem that the absence of electricity posed. Not perfect solutions, not elegant solutions by modern standards, but solutions. The people who lived those lives were not primitive. They were not waiting to be saved by a technology that was 600 years away. They were fully alive, fully engaged, fully human, managing the world they had, with the tools they had, with a competence and an ingenuity that, the more closely you look at it, the more genuinely impressive it becomes. Turn off the lights, not forever, just for a moment, and try to imagine building everything you need to survive from what the landscape provides and what your community knows. That's what they did every day, and mostly it worked.